All right. Hello, Catholic YouTube. Brian Keith with City of the Immaculata back with you. Joined today by a man who needs no introduction on this channel, I'm sure. Erick Ybarra is a well-known, blogger, has a YouTube channel of his own as well. He has been in the debate forum and the debates, prominent debates online, and several times over author at this point. Am I missing anything there, Erick?
No, but I feel like you've done. I feel like I've been learning from you lately. The last couple of weeks, I've been listening to your audios, and I've been learning quite a bit. So
The series I've done on Orthodoxy.
yes, yeah.
Yeah,
I
well,
still
we
have
were
to. I
just
still have to go back and listen to the one you did recently on the reactionary. I started it. I didn't finish it.
Yeah, I think that one and the one that's going to be coming out like this week, and it's the last one that I have in that series, are the two, in my humble opinion, the two best of that series. But you and I were talking backstage about the old Catholic Answer forum days as well, which I didn't really get to talk to you about. But Erick, I imagine you. I don't spend as much time on Facebook anymore, but you hosted a couple of Facebook groups. It was a Filioque group, and then a papal primacy group, and
Yes.
gosh, that goes back over a decade, I think, at this point as well too. And people come to me sometimes and they're like, well, where'd you get your chops? Because this is not the kind of stuff that other Catholics are talking about when they're talking about Orthodoxy. And honestly, it all goes back to those days, those early days of the Catholic Answer forums and those Facebook forums, because there was just I was just a it was the right place at the right time kind of situation, and you were there throughout all of that. You were always kind enough to answer my questions when I kind of came hat in hand with my questions to you. And yeah, it's been really great, man, to see your progress over these last several years.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So I got you on today to discuss a little belatedly, but it's kind of a timeless subject, your book Melchizedek and the Last Supper. And I guess without further ado, just to kind of jump right into it, this is a subject that, for somebody who's only ever been peripherally interested in the Protestant Catholic conversation, I never found the issues over justification as compelling. I know I feel like it's almost been whittled away to the point where there's at least some degree between some of the communions of an understanding there, even if it's agree to disagree, maybe still. But this particular subject that you've taken on in this book with the sacrifice of the Mass is probably the one that I find the most interesting of these
Oh, really?
conversations. It is. It's just there's something about it, and I've never really been able to quite put my finger on it. So this is why I was like, well, I really need to get Erick on here to discuss his book, because there's certain things in your book that you bring up. But I guess without, maybe starting at the end here, but when the Protestants, Erick, and I'm thinking largely, of those. Whenever I say Protestants, I'm typically in my mind thinking of that like first, second generation of reformers. When those men are looking at the Catholic Mass and they're making their critique of it, what is it that they see? Like, what do they see going on, and what is it that they're saying about the Catholic Mass?
Yeah, so it's there's a few earthquakes that happen, as you know, within the Protestant, the reforms of Germany and Geneva and in the British Isles. They themselves had divergences on the Mass. Their little they had I can't remember what they're called, but I used to know them off the top of my head. The colloquies, the
Was it
DI.
Magdeburg? Was that one of them?
Yeah, there we go. There we go. Yep, that was one of them. And Zwingli had his presentation, Calvin had his presentation, Luther had his presentation, and Luther was just absolutely thunderstruck by some of the conclusions that some of these fellows were coming to when it came to the real presence. Because for him, that was like that. I mean, for him, I think his insistence on the real presence, um in the way that he understood it, which, he used the in, with, and under as that became more popular in the Lutheran confessions. I think he was more adamant about that against the Protestants than he was on the issue of sola fide, like, and even the mass in the Catholic Church. I think even at one point he said that he'd rather drink blood with the papists um, than to drink wine with the symbolists. And
Hmm.
so he said it differently, but uh, that was a earthquake within the Protestant world. But the thing that they all shared, Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, and the English divines who, in one way or the other, were blending them all and coming up with their own new way of talking about it, was that the on the altar you do not have a re not a repeat of the sacrifice of Christ, but you don't have a fresh propitiatory immolation of Christ offered up upwardly upwardly to the Father, as if he was there on the cross again, you know, with the same death, not a second or third or fourth death, but the same single death sacrifice being offered up to the Father. There were some Anglicans, because the articles do talk, they call it a sacrifice, and some of the Lutherans called it a sacrifice, but they like to use the term or the phrase the sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving. And they tended to want to avoid this idea of like a propitiatory value um, on the altar, and that the priest was, ordained to do this on behalf of the living and the dead. And so, they insisted on the singularity of Calvary, of Calvary, and the um what they thought was the idolatrous and blasphemous nature of the Catholic Mass. That you've got this real, effectual, propitiatory sacrifice on the altar, and that as a consequence of that, the the physicality of the bread and the wine has to be changed into the substance of Christ's body and blood. That's something that was shared by the Greek East, the Coptic East, the Ethiopic East, the Armenian and Assyrian East, and the Latin Catholic Church, as can be seen in some of the Lutheran and Orthodox exchanges in the 16th century. That was something that, basically all of the apostolic churches held, but which none of the Protestant churches retained, until you had the Anglo Catholic movement.
Well, so if I can expand and correct me where I may be off on this, because this isn't my area of study so much, but they would say, for example, if you would take, I guess the sort of more reformed Anglican is kind of what comes to my mind, probably, or maybe even just Anglican, qua Anglican. But they would say that by this act of transubstantiating our Lord, removing the substance of bread and wine, and representing I guess, the body and blood of Christ in its place, to maybe be grotesque here to say that we're essentially like Frankensteining Jesus on the altar, and then just so that we could sacrifice him and kill him again, and then we do this over and over and over again.
Yeah,
Is that
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
what they're accusing us of there?
Yeah, yeah. So there was definitely a metaphysical problem because Jesus. Nobody had an issue with, um, the prologue of John. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. But the issue then was, okay, well, if he has a human body, then he abides by the law of the law of circumscription. The circumscribed body is spatially limited. And so, the term that they were using was like the locality of the body of Christ. It's in heaven, right? This was something that Calvin pushed hard. That you can't have the body of Christ and the blood of Christ here and everywhere on the globe, and then also in heaven. That just doesn't make sense. And then, well, the Lutherans, they they vehemently contradict Calvin in that regard. But for them, it's important, for two reasons, to say that the bread and the wine don't actually um, get changed in their substance. I know some of the Lutherans, if they're listening, they're going to say, "Oh no, we do say it's changed." Just like a human being who receives the Holy Spirit is changed and is, humanity divinized. But for them, it was important that um, the substance of Christ's body and blood in heaven is present in, with, and under the bread and the wine, and to retain the nature of a sacrament, which they insisted, the thing, the thing, and the thing signifying the thing, um, that those two things have to be different, and in order to keep those two things uh, in realities, you have to have the bread and the wine remain as it is, just as it was brought in through the front door. Um, but that led to several issues. I mean, there was back and forth. I mean, this is volumes written in the Reformation, Counter Reformation debates about this. But yeah, there were Christological, metaphysical debates. The Protestants they were baffled. Like,
Mhm.
once they started to go down the road of sola scriptura, and they found that they were able to successfully, and quite so, because a lot of the Catholics at the time they were just not prepared for some of these, like, Lutheran and French patristic scholars at the time, because some of the stuff just looks so starkly different from early Christianity to the late medieval period. So they were just having a heyday over a lot of these, all over a lot of Catholics. And so once they saw that, the Titanic had been hit sometime, whether it was the 1200s or the 800s, or, I know Calvin said that Pope Gregory the Great was the last good pope. Some of the reformers were saying we just want to go back to the purity of the fourth century. But you had others who said no, the ship hit the iceberg like in the 300s. They were all like giving different time periods of when they think this thing actually happened. But once they saw that the Titanic got hit, then for them it was like the defense shield was down. Now we can attack everything that sounds baffling to us, like the body of Christ being really present on the altar. That contradicts our metaphysics of locality. And they would they would, like a hummingbird, just go at it in different angles.
Yeah, I don't think you can underestimate just how, for post Tridentine Catholics, um, it's hard for us to put ourselves in that time frame between Luther sort of kicking that door open and Trent kind of settling these issues. Um, that's not to say that there weren't Catholic theologians in academia and these kind of places where these discussions had been happening, like they were happening, but you kind of get the sense after Luther that they're sort of happening in the beer halls all of a sudden, like arguments over the body and blood of Christ, and these. So, like the layman's kind of dealing with these things, and the Catholics in that window of time don't have the privilege to have the foresight of, or the hindsight, I guess, of Trent behind them. They don't
Right.
have that luxury that we have today as Catholics, to
Yeah,
kind of look
yeah. So
to Trent.
a lot of Catholics were kind of going like overboard with their descriptions of real presence too.
Mhm.
So
So I don't want to get too caught up in the whole like Protestant thing, but I do have at least one more question about them because they're always our conversations with Protestants are always pertinent and relevant and timely. But there's one category that I call kind of the slippery Protestants. I'm looking at my Anglo-Catholic brothers here in particular for this one. And I don't mean slippery as a pejorative, just that it's hard to nail them down on this subject. But is it safe to say that their critique of the Catholic Mass and the Eucharist, um, it's almost as if like it seems to me that they want to be able to say what is allowable, whereas they accuse the Catholics of kind of restricting to the definition, thereby restricting what they view as the ancient church's allowance of a divergence of opinion on the Eucharist. Is that a fair assessment of what's going on with the Anglo-Catholics?
I mean, I've seen Anglo Catholics go pretty hard on transubstantiation all the way. Um,
Hmm.
I'm thinking of one of my favorite Anglo Catholic books. It's called The King's Highway, written by Archdeacon George Carleton. Um, that book was very much a hyperdrive in for me on my Millennium Falcon ride into Catholicism, because of how close Carlton was to basically all of the scholastic tradition and the Council of Trent, and even on the issue of primacy, he's like, for the last 17 centuries, I think he was writing in the 1800s, um, that he was like, the last 17 centuries, it's very clear that the primacy of the church is divinely instituted, and that it was sort of like fixed in the See of Rome, and God chose that for the church, and that's how it was. He thought that he thought that the Vatican Council, which he was writing, I think he wrote just shortly after this, just went like a degree too high.
Hmm.
So it was almost like if you could just turn the needle just a little bit downward, then he would have been a Catholic, which to me seemed like such a bizarre position,
Hmm.
because nobody holds that view, that it was just a degree too much. It's everybody's like, oh, it's way too much, or we got to get rid of the whole thing. But I think he was pretty tough on his English colleagues for denying the necessity of transubstantiation. But
Hmm.
there are other books that I've read by Anglo Catholics who, when you read them, you think they're going in the direction of Trent. And it's kind of like you kind of have to read all the footnotes to see where they're backpedaling in their defense of the Catholic decrees at Trent. And yeah, like you said, they claim greater antiquity on their side because of the room that they believe is allowable for diversity. um and so their king and queen was Theodoret of Cyrus, Pope Galasius, and a few others, and they thought that the Catholics were actually getting further away from antiquity than themselves. Well, I think it's kind of silly. I mean, we look at the argumentation. I think transubstantiation is required. That's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, was because I think transubstantiation is required, um, even if the stream of tradition, there were fishes that got close to it but didn't quite get the accurate teaching.
Well, that's great. I want to begin there kind of with, I mean, it might actually be beginning midstream a little bit to keep with the analogy there. But what is the kind of diving in maybe to the scriptural basis for some of this? What is the Aaronic priesthood in its function and in its purpose?
Yeah, that's a good question. Boy, so the whole panorama of the story of God's Bible, or the storyline of the Bible, is God wanting to reunite with mankind. and to fulfill that destiny for his creatures, his image bearers, to come into communion with him through his son. And through sin, barriers were created, obviously, ontological, legal, physical. I mean, all these barriers were created, and so after mankind leaves the Garden of Eden, um, God has this nicely orchestrated project to sort of bring humanity back to this Edenic glory, so that the project can be finished. Um, and so what he started in Eden with was, you had a people, Adam and Eve. You had a place, the Garden of Eden, and you had this priestly vocation that they were supposed to represent the creator. They were supposed to dominate all of creation, and they were supposed to be, in a sense, priests and kings, which is, the two wings describing the saints in the book of in the Apocalypse. Well, that obviously didn't happen. So, we all in Christian theology, we all call it the fall of man, the whatever however you want to call it. And so they're out of that place. But you had people, a place, and a function. And with uh, the Israelites, the sons of Jacob, they all go into Egypt. They come out of Egypt, symbolizing this rescue mission from this spiral downward into slavery and to anguish and um, bondage. And so they're rescued out and they're brought into a place. So now you've got the people back, you've got a place situated. So we're like, God is sort of like re-Edenizing the earth in the land of promise. It's not just a land for real estate's sake. It's a land where God will be God and his people will be God's people. Um, and so, but the thing is, they're coming out of Egypt. They're unclean. It's obvious because of all these barriers that still exist. I mean, he comes down on the mountain. He's like, no, you can't even come close if you've been with your wife last night. It's like they've got to
Mm.
be they've got to be extra pure just to get to a certain distance away from him. And so it's very clear that God is still, he's wanting to be in communion with his people, but there's still these barriers. So he's got to go through mediators. He's got to go through angels and representatives. And even then, you know, you got to build closures like the tabernacle, and Moses is the only one who can come up, and Aaron's got to be some distance away back from Moses. Well, the priesthood then was created in that covenant in order to establish um, forgiveness and communion. You know, and so you've got the Aaronic priesthood set up in order to establish a way to make atonement, atonement for the sins of the people, and for the Israelites to uh, sort of identify with these victims in repentance and enjoy uh, God's presence. That's really what the Aaronic priesthood was um, set up to do. But as we know, in the grand scheme, God did this beautifully, um, but it wasn't an end in and of itself. It was still a bus stop calling for a much greater reality.
So was the assumption there for a first century Jew, just picking the first century as an example, that the temple sacrifices would eventually cease? Because I know, like when you're reading the Pauline letters, um, this is the case that's being made. But is that strictly in light now that we have the revelation of Christ, or would that have been sort of an a priori assumption on the part of like a first century Jew?
Well, that's a great question. Brian, I don't know. I mean, Peter, Saint Peter in I think it's in First Peter. He says that some of the prophets were given uh like supernatural infusion to
Hmm.
know certain things about messianic times, but even they, I mean, they would be jealous of us for sure. um,
Well, you can imagine too, like with Paul, if that's the case, with Paul, with the ability to, um, in a relatively short time from the death, from the sacrifice of and death and resurrection of Christ to the time that Paul is penning his letters, and sort of explicating on what the significance of this is. It's not a whole lot of time in between there. So to, um, I mean, of course, we believe Scripture is divinely inspired, so we know where the inspiration's coming from. But to be able to bring that to the fullness that Paul manages to do, just um, really, I guess, through the ability of his own pen and maybe working in conjunction with the other apostles, it's a really just a phenomenal thing there to
it,
consider.
yeah, I am baffled. I find myself baffled sometimes about how those conversations would have gone, in the synagogues,
Hmm.
because in one sense, I would think that the Jewish scholars had the upper hand by the what do the Protestants call it? The normal, historical, grammatical reading of the Old Testament.
Hmm.
Um, the apostles would have had an uphill battle in one sense. But I think that once the events happened, like once the story gets told about the kings or the Magi, Bethlehem, the flight to Egypt, the baptism at the River Jordan, the 40 days in the wilderness. It's like something clicks that, oh my goodness, there's this meta narrative of Israel retold, and then the Daniel's fulfillment in the ascension, and it's like, oh my goodness, this is the Israelite destiny. And only when you see the events, then you can go back and look at the Old Testament and put the remaining uh blocks in the Rubik's cube together, because otherwise it's just an unresolved problem. You've got all these promises, these covenants, and then after AD 70, it's like, what do we do to resolve this? There is nothing. There is nothing.
Mhm.
So I think the story of Christ is the only way. It can Did Aaron or Moses know that? I mean, maybe, but I couldn't tell you how if they did.
So Eric, I'm going to lay this out and what it looks like to me, and you can tell me as the uninitiated, as that I am, if I'm onto something here. So you're reading Genesis, and you're reading the story of Abraham, and everything's kind of following a fairly logical sequence, one thing to the next. But then all of a sudden, like out of nowhere, in Genesis 14, you see this man, a king no less, Melchizedek. And usually when there's a king introduced, there's a little bit of fanfare involved in the introduction of a king. But no, all of a sudden there's a king in the picture. And not just any king, but he's the priest of Zion. He kind of shows up, according to Genesis. He offers a sacrifice, and as quickly as he's there, he's gone, just like that. And then the Abraham story kind of continues on. So again, as a novice to exegeting scripture, am I right to notice the abruptness and maybe the strangeness of that moment?
No, I think so. I mean, I think like and please understand, like I'm elbow to elbow with you on this. Like I'm still intrigued to learn about Melchizedek, because I think the author to the Hebrews, he is reading the text of Genesis this way, almost like he's assuming his readers are somewhat familiar. I mean, he's kind of like, I don't want to say teasing them, but he's kind of reprimanding them, like, you guys are still on to like milk, you know, but this is so basic, we've got to go to it. Um, yeah, he in the narrative he sees the Melchizedek scene as sort of like a stage prop for the future times. Like it's like a cast. It casts the story. It's like a bookend. It's a book beginning, waiting for the bookend for him.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting, like if you think about sort of the primitive state of things at the time of Abraham. Of course, we're not to Moses yet. We're not to the Exodus and to the flight into Egypt, into the exile, and all of these things, and then the return to the promised land, and then the building up of the temples and the Davidic kingdom and all of these things. You're at like a very like sort of primitive moment. It seems like when you're dealing with this moment where Melchizedek arises. So I think though just the placement of it is kind of fascinating, as well. You sort of hinted at it there. You alluded to the fact that with the letter to the Hebrews, um, yeah, they're gonna. It's at that moment he's going to see a huge amount of significance to this event. So what is the importance of the Melchizedek priesthood instead of the Aaronic for the author of Hebrews?
Yeah. Well, if your audience accepts Pauline authorship of Hebrews, I've always had problems with it, but I like to stick with it because it's got like that note of antiquity, but there's also like some gaps. But Paul had this way of referring to the Old Testament as a mystery that has been revealed, and and for him, that revelation only came with Christ. So it's like almost like even the Old Testament saints would have had some degree of a veil in the reading of the Old Testament. Because I know, like in our Calvinistic, like, well, at least in my Calvinistic days, when we read Second Corinthians 3, where Paul talks about a veil over the hearts of the reading of the Old Testament, or a veil over the eyes of unbelievers, we just use that as a proof text for total depravity. but for Paul, I think it's a redemptive historical veil too, where even the Old Testament saints um, were only dimly, you know, at best, seeing things of the future. And so the author to the Hebrews, the significance of that is that Abraham, who is obviously the root and shoot of the children of Israel, right? You've got this person who's not a child of Abraham, who's a priest, a high priest of the God Most High, and to whom Abraham uh, obeys, and he obeys, and he gives in obedience a tithe to this high priest. And so there's this qualitative contrast between the priesthood that can come out of Abraham, which is obviously like the Aaron and the Levites, and the quality of this high priest that Abraham, who cannot be less than what comes from him, he recognizes a greater priesthood than himself. Um, so that's the first thing, is that, well, obviously, if we're thinking in Semitic culture, corporate representation, the Levites were basically in the loins of Abraham. So the Levites themselves, retrospectively speaking, were already subservient to Melchizedek as a priest. And so that right there is a hint that the Levitical system is not the best thing. It's not there's there's something greater, you know. And then so he takes that note of superiority, the inferiority of the Levites under Melchizedek because Abraham's under Melchizedek. Then he grabs one of the Psalms. He grabs King David, which talks about the future messianic times, and says that that there's going to be a priest, an eternal priest, according to the order of Melchizedek, as he as was already hinted, is greater than Levi. um, and so this is coming in the future with the Messiah. So it sort of in it doesn't it's a necessary implication that there's an expiration date on the Levitical priesthood to make way for Melchizedek's order in some way to be the final act, the final enduring act in God's plan.
So typically, what I've seen when this subject is kind of broached is, tr- I think of when it comes to popular works, um, I think of like Scott Hahn's what is it?
The
The
Lamb's
Lamb's
Supper.
the Lamb Supper, and then I know Brant Petrie wrote. I think it's
The
Jesus and
Jewish
the
roots of the Eucharist.
Yes, Jewish roots of the Eucharist. And it seems like there's a lot of emphasis, and this again may be like more of a modern emphasis than it is historical. I'm not as familiar with that, but there's a lot of emphasis always, of course, on the Passover aspects of the sacrificial meal that takes place at the Mass. But
Right.
I think you said you specifically chose this one. Um, not in contra to that, but sort of complementary to that. But
Yeah.
what was it about this? Whether it was the patristic sources on it or whatever that may be, what was it that chose you to sort of take this specific avenue?
Yeah, this will get us really into the meat here because I really started my studies in Melchizedek when I was an Anglican because I was an Anglo Catholic. I was attending Anglican Cathedral of the APA, Anglican Province of America, um, on the East Coast, and I, like you were referring to at the beginning about the Catholic forms, I was actually not satisfied with like the typical John 6, First Corinthians 10, 11 arguments, and because I know I'm reading some of the English divines, and they had some good explanations that all struck the same chord, but we didn't believe that we had to become Roman Catholics or Eastern Orthodox because of that. So I'm like, I don't know. I just wasn't satisfied enough with the apologetics surrounding those texts. So I'm like, is there something that in Scripture that can really like put this into fifth gear and really require a Catholic or an Orthodox? And here when I say Orthodox, I don't want to, no insult to my e- Oriental or the Church of the East. I hate to put you guys under one term, but for goodness sake and brevity's sake, the Orthodox understanding of a propitiatory priesthood, you know, and transubstantiation. I saw this Melchizedekian motif as sort of the biblical proof that there wasn't another option. And so that if somebody wanted to really be a Bible believer, a Bible believing Christian, um, they're going to have to find some school on the earth that teaches transubstantiation and the true authentic propitiatory sacrifice on the altar. And I think in the intro, I said you can, obviously you can go to the Catholic Church or the Orthodox churches, maybe some Anglo Catholic churches. I think there's the Polish National Church, and there might be, I don't know, there might be someone out there who believes in transubstantiation for the same reasons, but it really does exclude basically all of your magisterial, your continental, and your confessional Protestants.
Are you familiar, Eric, with any of the disputations that took place around Berengar of Tours and in that era?
Yes, yeah. In fact, I can't remember why I was doing. Oh, yeah, I think it was in my talks with Sean Luke that I picked up a volume that went through that whole controversy.
Is he
Um,
Anglican?
yeah, Sean Luke is definitely Anglican. I'm trying to look and see if I have it on the shelf somewhere. Um, Collins, I think O'Connor is the last name of the priest who wrote the book, and he goes through the whole historical controversy and much more. But it's man, it's a murky debate.
Yeah, it is, and I don't think it's as. I know that's why I could only guess that he was Anglican because I know the Anglicans like to point to that moment, those periods of
Yeah,
disputations right then,
yeah,
to kind of justify where they stand today. But yeah, I don't think it's as clear cut as they want to make it in terms of whether or not it was a. Um, oh gosh, how do I want to frame this? There's periods in the church where. Um, for example, when somebody like Saint Jerome is has a little bit of a questionable response to Nicaea's use of homoousia, right? Like
right,
because there was context that he was harkening back to that made him, but 200-300 years removed, and the orthodoxy of the council has sort of worked itself out. Then you shouldn't be like, you should have not be disputing the
right,
homoousia at that point. But what they want to say, if my understanding, like really with what the Anglicans are saying, was that, well, you point to this moment of time. You've got Berengar of Tours, you've got Saint Lanfranc in Bec.
yep,
They're having these written disputations back and forth. So you see that kind of proves that this was still up for grabs at that point in time. And then, Rome, well, Eric, my point is kind of like, well, if Rome kind of dropped the gauntlet, then that kind of solves the issue anyways. So case
right,
closed. But also it was sort of settled at a conciliar level too, because it was one of the
yeah,
Lateran councils that
yes, yeah.
uh,
I actually have one of the CUAP presses, the medieval continuation on those debates. And so I've read like the apologetics against these early skeptics of the real presence, the real, like, the transubstantiation. And I wish I had. I think it's somewhere close by. I might be able to find it, but so I'm familiar with those debates, and it is noteworthy that certain theologians had an awareness of the flexibility. But see, they were often arguing for something specific too,
mhm.
you know. So that like when there were some famous, you know, the I don't know, the Byzantines would call it the Florilegia, the Catinas of, you know, Augustine that proved the endurance of bread and wine after the consecration. And those, I mean, I think they needed to be argued, but uh, it was something of which the clarity was not apparent. And the clarity only comes as a result of digging further into the logic, the tradition, the scriptures, the coherence of what's actually being believed.
Yeah, and I don't think it's as clear for Berengar as maybe the Anglicans would want it to be, because I mean he did have the support of his students, which would make sense. But as far as the community of theologians that were around him at times, I'm not going to say it was universal. I haven't looked at it enough. But it seems like the majority, at least, supported Lanfranc. And that seemed to be kind of the majority opinion at the point of the theologians. And even when Berengar of Tours, I do know this much, one of the sources that he wants to hearken back to was misattributed to John Scotus Erigena, not to be confused with Blessed John Duns Scotus, the
Right.
Franciscan from later periods, but Erigena's it was a misattribution because it wasn't actually from Erigena, but the thought was that kind of shores up the antiquity of the argument that Berengar was making, but he wasn't aware at the time that it was actually I can't remember exactly who it was that the work was proven to be from. I think it was a French theologian, but it was much later, much closer actually to the time of Berengar himself, and doesn't actually have I mean, it's like with Erigena, he's a little bit questionable anyways.
Yeah,
But
he is.
it doesn't have that pedigree even of him,
Yeah.
in terms of I'm not great at weighing out theological notes or anything, but in terms of the precedence of a great theologian holding to the position of Berengar Tours, I'm not totally convinced of the matter.
Yeah, well, I think that those who were defending classical transubstantiation, they were doing the same thing as their interlocutors were doing. They were going into the sources and they were looking at um, what made sense. Whether it was the liturgy, the Roman canon, um, patristic statements. There, but the transubstantiation line, um, if you could look at like the first 1,200 years of Christendom, you've got a few, maybe four or five, six, I don't know. You've got a number of different streams of Eucharistology, and I would say that there is one that is the greatest, the clearest, the most beautiful, and which actually does go back to the Last Supper. And I think that the church put its stamp of approval on that one.
Well, I guess in that same vein, what is the actual like? I hate to do a reductionist, but I'm actually just genuinely curious here. But what is like the bare minimum um, propositions about the Eucharist that a Catholic must hold to? And I'm thinking here of, like, for example, when the Anglican ordinariate, like when they come into the church, like what do we bind them to when they come in?
Oof. Yeah, that's a good question. Mm, well, you know, I would think, and I could be totally wrong about this, that obviously the decrees of Trent on the Mass are required for belief. The decrees of Lateran 1215, uh, which gets cited again in the Catechism of 1992. So that is transubstantiation. I really don't think that you can get any further reduced than that. Transubstantiation, and that the the offering is of a propitiatory value to both the living and the dead, because some Anglicans were willing to go far and say that it was for the living, but not the dead, because that assumes some superstitious beliefs, but I think that would be a bare minimum for whatever the sixth or seventh session of Trent, you know, its decrees and canons against what the Protestants were saying.
Yeah, I find one of the things I find really challenging about this debate, Eric, is that when I go back and read into, and most of my reading, if it's not obvious, has been in the Anglican tradition. Whenever I do read
Oh,
Protestants,
really?
I
Nice.
find them the most interesting.
Yeah, I do too. I do too.
But when you read the oath against transubstantiation, right? So for anybody that doesn't
Yeah.
know, to get any kind of at one point to get any kind of civil, military, or royal position in the UK, you had to take a verbal oath specifically dedicated to denying any belief in the Roman Catholic understanding of transubstantiation. And this is after the Tridentine clarification, because I have heard some Anglicans, the Anglo Catholics, say that, well, the clarifications of Trent actually clears up a lot for us, so that makes it easier for us to, whether we agree or disagree. But then I go and I read, so if you take the modern Anglo Catholics, right, and they say, well, oh no, it's no big deal, we're actually allowed to hold the Catholic position, and you juxtaposition that against, like, for example, the oath against transubstantiation. It's like either I missed something really important along the way, or they're just not being consistent here, or what I think is probably the case, the English Protestant tradition just has this inbuilt historical contradiction. But it's a pretty big contradiction. I mean, you can tell in these oaths that they're using transubstantiation as a stand-in to reject our views on the sacraments,
Oh,
authority,
yeah.
on the role of the priesthood.
Yep.
And I think that those early reformers, I think that they rightly see the Eucharist as something of like a focal point of many of our other divergences. And look, I always want to be like charitable, especially since I have a love and affinity for the English. I have mostly English blood after all, but it just seems like a glaring contradiction where they want to say yes and no to two diametrically opposed positions. I'm kind of rambling here, but that's the sense that I get when I've
Yeah.
when I've looked into this and kind of questioned what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, look, they study like some of the like the articles, um, in the Oxford movement, and you could see some of these, patristic, resurgences, and they're starting to see, a high doctrine of the Eucharist, and some of those Anglicans uh, got to the point where you know, subconsciously, inadvertently, I don't know which one, they realized that, Rome was closer to the truth than they were from in any distance from it. But they just sort of ignore like that hostile foundation of
Mhm.
the English reform. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the like fatal flaw of the Oxford movement. As much as I respect its writers, I
Yeah.
just think that's the fatal blow. I do think that the the opposition to the Oxford movement coming from those contemporary Anglicans kind of had a point when they were criticizing some of the arguments that the Oxford movement was trying to
Yeah.
like violently wrest from history the Catholicity of the Anglican community.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying, look, I do like, look, there's some brilliant, and you've been helpful with me on this before, Eric, too, because I've learned quite a bit from the Anglicans. Things I didn't like. There's certain presuppositions I took for granted. There was a lot of people don't know this, but there was a period where the Anglicans, especially around that time of the Oxford movement, their patristic, in an academic sense, their knowledge of the patristics. It was something of a golden age
Yeah.
at that period in the 19th century, and then flowing downward. And yes, there was a large contingent of them that ended up crossing the Tiber, which I find fascinating in and of itself. But it wasn't necessarily born of the what was taking place in Rome at the time, because actually, if you read St. John Henry Newman on his trips to Rome, he wasn't exactly impressed with what he saw there at the time.
Yeah, no, what's interesting about Newman is that he was obviously an extremely intelligent man, but he lived in both worlds of, and it wasn't like when he was an Anglican, he was completely ignorant of history, and then he learned history, and then became Catholic. he knew a lot about history,
Hmm.
and he was vehemently against Rome with that very knowledge. Like, I don't know if a lot of Catholics have ever read his his defenses against Catholicism. They could almost, you know, they can almost hook you. Like some of the arguments he made against Rome, before in his pre-Catholic days. So, but what's so fascinating is that he was able to be equally as educated as he was later in life about of the patristic history, and yet be an Anglican at one point and then be a Catholic at another. It wasn't that he needed more education about the church fathers and the councils. It was how do how does what those fathers and councils taught keep two legs?
Hmm.
Because with the Anglican church, the way it doesn't have maybe half a leg to hop on. And so in order for there to be two legs for the church, as we say in the creed, one holy Catholic and apostolic church, there has to be some dynamism that maintains continuity, but then embraces an authentic growth. And that's really, it wasn't learning what this father said or what that father said. For like a lot of people today who convert from Anglicanism to Catholicism, they read Ignatius of Antioch and it's like, oh my goodness, that's not how it was for eh, uh, Newman or any of the people who followed him into through swimming through the Tiber. And the proof of that is some of the guys that stayed behind, they continued to argue about
Hmm.
those things.
Yeah, it's actually kind of heart-wrenching at times to see that process for Newman. If I'm sure you're familiar, you read his Apologia,
Yeah.
and just everything that was kind of happening to him because he, I believe he was disfellowed from Oxford over it. I mean, that would make sense for the time period, as well as just his entire network of that he had built up, of colleagues and trustees and
Yeah.
students, and this like he gave all of that up for an idea. I mean, essentially,
Yep. Yeah. Quite a story.
So I have at least one question I see here. Let me put it up on the screen. Can you guys explain the views of Christ being locally present in substance in the sacrament versus not being locally present in a physical way in the Eucharist?
Yeah. Well, the word local is used in a very specific way back then. Um, I mean, it really did mean something that was like a package deal. You couldn't be invisible and and not be local and be locally present. Like if you're locally present, that's because I can take my hand and move it across space and touch the texture, of that substance with its visibility and everything else. Um, but the argument that Aquinas made and that the Catholic Church would make is that um, Christ is not present in that way. He's present in substance, um, but it's not a discernible mystery. We know we know that Christ is there, um, and we know that there's a circumscription. I'm just trying to make a word for that, of his body in heaven. It's not like there's like these tiny microscopic reductions of, half lives of atoms off of his blood, in his body, shedding off through the ages. He retains the fullness of his physical stature. None of that goes away. But then there is this miracle of sort of, he gives himself underneath the appearances of bread and wine, and there's some sort of compenetration between human digestion and the real substance of Christ's body and blood. Um, I hate to talk, over this because he's asking for a specific answer. He's asking for an explanation. We stop short of certain things when they get to that level.
Yeah, I feel like with the Eucharist, I love scholastic distinctions, but I kind of keep to my areas that I feel the most comfortable with. And when it comes to the areas that I know, I will. Uh, I heard a priest say one time that you're only when you're giving a lecture, you're only allowed three heresies during the course of that lecture.
Yeah,
So I don't.
yeah.
I would probably play all three of my hands if I were to like start breaking down the scholastic distinctions for you of the local presence in the Eucharist. Now there is quite a bit of discussion in the chat here about the couch there, Eric. So I'm just going to got a tough one here for
Oh,
you. How
yeah.
comfortable is the couch?
Very. This comfortable is very comfortable. This is my library, and I have to make sure that whenever we do Bible studies, like right now, my boys and I were going through First Samuel. If they sit in this couch, it's almost certain they'll fall asleep within 5 minutes. So I have some chairs on the other side of the room where they sit, forces them to be in a more angular, upright position.
Well, what else? What else you got going on, Eric? I know you got a forthcoming project you're looking to have released here pretty soon, right?
Yes, yeah, that one's going to be on the atonement. That one's also deeply rooted in my pre-Catholic days.
You're
Always
going to be
been
taking on Anselm at all in there?
yeah, a little bit. Yeah, a little bit. That was another thing that I was concerned about in my abrupt and very anxious uh sort of I was frozen in place at the fork between Byzantium and Rome. And one of the things I just kind of got me concerned about, especially with like some of the modern Orthodox presentations, is this vehement. Uh, it wasn't just like a critique. It was this like they saw it with this they saw it as repugnant. The idea that Christ is this penal victim that stands in our place to satisfy the justice of God. And that was a concern of mine, and I thought, okay, well, maybe this one person, and maybe that other Eastern Orthodox theologian said that, but maybe it's not widespread. But no, I'd continue to hear it in like the ancient faith podcasts. I would hear it in Saint Vladimir Seminary Press publications. I'd hear it in symposiums. It's like, wait a minute, like this seems to have become part of the Orthodox phronema, like what they like to call their way of thinking. That the atonement is really not has nothing to do with these Latin legal categories. This idea of God, having to cool off from exhausting his wrath on some target. If they always, I just never got their understandings of the Catholic or even the Protestant view seemed out of proportion to me, and so that was something that I never took my eye off of that, but I see it also in the Catholic Church too, though sometimes, and I won't mention any names, but there are some big names out there who, when they hear penal substitution, they also think that it's heretical, you know. And so I thought to myself, either I'm crazy or I need to look into this. So I looked into it. I've been studying it throughout the years, and I finally think I've come to a point where I have enough patristic, scholastic, Thomistic, and even post-Tridentine Catholic theologian support for a penal substitution that is orthodox and not problematic at all. So yeah, that's what that project's all about.
Yeah, I do find with some of the I don't even know if it probably is just like modern Catholic apologetics, that there's a tendency to want to whitewash some of our traditional teachings on things almost out of a sense of embarrassment. And I would grant that there's certain like medieval um, devotions and practices that sort of come about that you do have to have some proper context to justify if you're talking to a Protestant or if you're talking to an Orthodox. But sometimes the way that Catholics have, like you were saying, yeah, and you don't have to name names.
Mm.
Sorry about all of that, like, well, we're sorry about that mistake that we made on. It's like no, that's not an option. That we don't get to do that, right? Like we
Yeah.
either have to accept these things, um, and most of the time when if you go back, because I actually do, I spent a little bit of time with Anselm, and that period at the Abbey of Bec and what he's doing, and the Orthodox, some of the keener Orthodox they're very vocal and active right now. And they've got their sights on Anselm because they see him as sort of a fissure, a breaking point with that unchanging first millennium church, right? And you do have to have some familiarity with the context of what was going on at the Abbey of Bec, the curriculum that Lanfranc sort of brought about, and then the tendency I find, Eric, is that there's when you're 500, when you're 1,000 years removed from a historical character, he tends to, like Anselm in particular, tends to get like sort of weighed down with things that happened after him,
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
penal substitution of these things, but if you just take these authors, these specific writers, on their own terms, the context in which they're writing, and oftentimes it's much easier to defend. Now, I can't say that necessarily for like a Baroque theologian, right? If you're
Hmm.
talking significantly later, then you may have to do a little bit more legwork.
Yeah.
Um, but we're definitely anticipating that one. Um, I've always appreciated the work. Eric, I'm a little bit different. Like I think most people probably turn to you, Eric, for everybody. It just seems like everybody wants to know about the Orthodox, and I get it, right? It's a little bit of there's a little bit of mystery behind the Orthodox, and it's like you kind of have to demystify them before you can even do apologetics, towards them. But I find the work that you've been doing on the Protestant stuff um, just as important, if not more important, because we've been dealing, I think, for 25 years now or more with really bad apologetics towards Protestants. And I don't
Yes.
think you're
Yes.
going to, yes, certainly you can win, a low church maybe. And I'm like all souls that come to the fullness of truth, praise be to God. But um, and Catholics are guilty of this. Orthodox are guilty of this. They underestimate some of the Protestant arguments
Absolutely.
and the
Yeah.
cohesiveness and the some of the solidness of the Protestant arguments, which I don't think you've ever done. And you get criticized a lot, Eric. I've been following you long enough to sort of know that your approach to these things is, and you can always correct me if I'm wrong in this, but this is how I've always felt what I've watched sort of you do apologetics over the years is you'll take like a criticism that maybe the Protestants will lob at Catholics, and instead of doing that thing where you like dismiss it, you'll effectively engage it to the point that some people actually think
I'm
that you've
becoming a
taken on,
Protestant. Yeah.
that you've become Protestant. Like I've seen that a lot with people that, like, I'm like, they're just not familiar, I guess, with the way that you approach these things. But it's actually much more effective, I think, in the long term, because I can't tell you how many Protestants I've seen over the years that respect your work.
Yeah, well, I think Sean Luke is a good example because he keeps coming back. So we're supposed to do another discussion on justification, and I think we're going to do another one on the Eucharist, specifically, I think, on Melchizedek. And he is an example of a guy who's reading all of the 16th century, 17th century literature, and that's very rare. It's very rare for somebody to do that. Most people just they read like the Institutes, they read Luther on Galatians and Romans. They might read some of the um, the Concord documents and things like this. But now Sean Luke is like one of those who's really studying the commentaries, the creeds, and the confessions, and really trying to um, what he would call Catholicize the Protestant reform. And it's so interesting to me. It really is, because I think Catholicism is so right on where it landed. But in order to make that manifest, we've really got to walk down these trails with the Protestants, to show them, to show them why the Catholic Church made the decisions that they did, that she did, and why they're not crazy for the arguments that they're bringing up. Because that's what some Catholics do. They kind of make these Protestants feel like they just don't know how to read, or they're not reading enough. It's like, my goodness, some of these Protestants have read more books than some of these Catholics, have ever read on any particular subject. So
Yeah, and it's amazing to me when you find, and I think the Orthodox are actually guilty of this more than Catholics, but you'll hear, and I think this is really they're just repeating Jay Dyer at that point. You'll hear them say, for example, that Catholics are unable to do internal critiques, or Catholics fail the epistemology test, right? And it's like at the same time they'll turn to Protestants, and the arguments that I see them making against Protestants, they're assuming the Orthodox position on the Protestants, when it's like, do you even know any of the epistemic arguments that Protestants made? Like, they're
yeah,
not beholden to the seven ecumenical councils the way that you guys are. They don't have to, like, well, I say that with a grain of salt, but you know what I'm saying, right?
right.
It's
I
like
know what you mean.
it's not that infallible source for
Right,
them as a
right.
rule of authority. So they actually have much more leeway in that sense
Yes.
than the Orthodox do, which gives them a little more wiggle room and some of the tricky, sticky history that's out there.
Yeah, yeah. It's like it's that Chadwickian liberty where you can touch grass at any particular year in the first 15 centuries, but not necessarily. It's quite a advantage. It's quite an advantage.
So I was going to try to finish up here. I got two more, it looks like two more questions. If you got a few minutes, maybe
Yeah,
just
that's fine.
run them by. Let's see. With vicarious satisfaction and the cross bearing the meritorious cause of our justification, doesn't it seem like imputed righteousness is very Catholic, even if almost unspoken of today by many?
Ooh, the Catholic OCD podcast. This guy is great. This guy here is like, um, he had me on the show. I want to say like 2 years ago, and we had a discussion on justification. And I noticed he is like the exception of a Catholic who he's kind of doing the same thing that you were just describing, where he knows the Protestant position. He doesn't want to just stuff it, no matter how strong it is, and just sort of like dismiss it. And he's seeing where the Protestants are coming from, where the Catholics are coming from, where both of them are really agreeing without knowing that they agree, and then where precisely are the disagreements. And that's valuable. I think that imputed righteousness is it's in the Bible. I mean, I don't know how we can get around it. It's in the Bible. The question is what does it mean? And and this is where Catholics, they try to, and I don't want to accuse anyone of doing this, but it seems like a habit of Catholics is to take the imputed righteousness to basically just mean the infusion of righteousness, and then God recognizes that you're righteous because he infused it in you. And um, while that's true, there that's not exactly what Paul is saying in Romans 4 when he talks about imputed righteousness. And so I want to be fair to Catholics. I don't want to just dismiss what they're saying. I also don't want to ignore what the Protestants are rightly pointing at, which is that when Paul says imputed righteousness, he really just means the erasing of our guilt. You know, what in Colossians 2, it's like the all of the handwriting requirements, that whole Greek phrase there, just basically like the docket of penalties nailed to the cross. And it's done because the righteousness of Jesus, he merited the erasing of our guilt by his love, his charity to the Father, and his obedience unto death. No Catholic should deny that. I mean, it's right there in Trent. Justification is not only the remission of sins, but also the sanctification of the interior man. But notice that it says it is the remission of sins plus the inner sanctification of man. It's that, and then also, the increase of justification and the final justification at the end of time. So I think the imputed righteousness debate should be over with. Like Catholics and Protestants, we should agree on that already. And like I told Jordan Cooper in a podcast about a year and a half ago, we should move to where we really disagree. Temporal satisfaction of debts after baptism, purgatory. Those are the areas where I think there's still real disagreement.
This one's a little off topic, but I'll bring it up. I've been reading a bit on Molinism, on the Molinism debate, and sort of regarding it. I'd like to know how often you find it that theological questions go unanswered for means of political expediency. I have some thoughts on that, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Eric.
I don't know if he's referring to like the debates between the Dominicans. Maybe he's referring to that.
I think that's what he's referring to.
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't have much to say on it. Only thing I've ever said about that is that it's proof that the Catholic Church can find, giving it the most generous interpretation, it could find something like a mystery like this and realize that almost to the point where there may have been a disagreement even amongst the apostles. Like, this is something I thought about many years ago. I thought, like, what if the apostles got together to talk about this debate about predestination and all of that? Well, I certainly know where Paul would go. Okay. But I'm not exactly sure where the rest of the apostles would go. And it's a possibility in my mind that with Romans 9, there might be something of a kind of like First Corinthians 7, where it's like, not I, but the Lord, where there may have been like the apostles would have said, let's not really decide on this.
I had I don't remember exactly which pope it was. I want to say it's one of the Clemens. I was going to look it up, but it doesn't really matter. Anyways, my particular take on these things, I'm doing like a series actually on this channel right now. We're going through, we recently just did like a survey of like modern historical criticism, and the Walter Bauer and his work on orthodoxy and heresy, where he basically like reinvents Christian history, revolutionizing, taking it away from the Eusebian view of and even the Augustinian view of history as like a linear line of orthodoxy from 33 AD to our modern day, where Bauer says, no, it's these competing factions all vying for, in the beginning, there was maybe 5 or 6 different quote unquote Christian factions. And it just happened to be that the Nicene faction like won the day by the time you get to Constantine, that whole history. So my answer to that would be to you there, Nicholas. Well, one, come back and I'm doing a series of lives, watch some of the lives. That would be the first thing. But two, you have to read history providentially. So, your question is like whether these things are for means of political expediency. Yeah, it could be in the moment, any given thing that like a pope or a prelate or a theologian or anybody does may be done for expediency, but these are all done within God's providence. And there's a fantastic story about this very subject that you're talking about, where I think it was one of the Clements, I believe. Anyways, it was in the time of Robert Bellarmine. These disputations were all the rage at the time, and the Pope was heavily leaning on the side of the Dominicans, and he was going to come down on the side of the Dominicans. And, Bellarmine was a Jesuit, and he kind of sat on, I think it was the, it wasn't Molinus and it wasn't the Thomistic position. There was like a sort of a center predestination position. I forget what it was called, but anyways, Bellarmine is talking with a fellow theologian, and the theologian saying, any day now, the Pope's going to come down on this, and it's going to be the Dominicans. We know it. And Bellarmine said he won't do it. He's like, what do you mean he won't do it? Like, he's going to do it any day now. Bellarmine said he won't live long enough to see it happen. And within the time frame of before the Pope Clement could get this decision made, he passed away. And then the next Pope wasn't interested in the debate. So it kind of dropped at that point. So, but anyways, that just goes to show that Bellarmine had sort of the foresight. A little bit of a premonition there, but also like these things happen. And yes, if you don't like how sausage is made, don't go to the sausage factory. Especially don't go looking at the conciliar, the back, there's people that talk about like the nefarious things taking place at behind the scenes at Vatican II, and I'm just like, did you ever look at Chalcedon? Did you ever kind of see some of the stuff and some of the later ones after Chalcedon? There was some pretty wild things going on behind the scenes for all of these. So if you want to talk about political expediency, what was the one where it's the 3 chapters?
That's the 5th council.
Yeah. So that's my answer to that. I know it's a little long-winded, but anyways, just to say hi to her. I see Diane there in the comments.
Hello.
She's a wonderful
she also goes back to the old forum days. I remember seeing her comment in Father Benedict Anderson's blog. He was an Orthodox guy. I think he was the books. He worked at the bookstore at St. Vlad's. I can't remember, but he had a blog, and it was called. I think it was called Cathedra Unitatis, the Chair of Unity, and he was charting his conversion from Orthodoxy to Rome. And in the comments there, you had Dr. William Ty, you had Perry Robinson, Nathaniel McCullum. Those are the early. This was like 2004, 2005, 2006. So she's been around. Yeah.
All right, Eric, I appreciate you coming on. Anything else that you want people to know about? Or I know we've mentioned the book.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, the book's probably going to come out. The fixed date is March 29th. Yeah, I think it's March 29th. Could be to the 27th. It's supposed to be the day before Holy Week starts. So
I'm working on my first in terms of editing. I got a publisher, but man, that editing, boy, it takes a long time to get a book out there.
It's terrible. It's terrible. Yeah.
So anyways, we'll be on the lookout for that. And thank you for coming on, Eric.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. God bless everyone.